Everybody who looked at those 41 acres called it swamp ground. Black soil so wet in spring that trucks sank to the axle just trying to cross it. But Elias Reed didn't see a swamp. He saw water sitting somewhere it shouldn't have been sitting, and water was something he understood. By 1995, Elias was 50 years old. He'd left the Kansas pasture in a neighbor's care that spring and taken on a new lease out in Ohio. 41 acres of dark organic muck ground that most of the farmers around it wouldn't touch. The soil looked rich, almost black, the kind of ground that made a man's hands feel heavier just from turning it over. But every spring, it held water close to the surface, and machinery that tried to work it too early came out coated to the frame. The local word for it was simple: swamp. Elias had spent years working drainage on county roads, learning that a water table wasn't some fixed condition. It moved with small things: the depth of a ditch, the grade of an outlet, half an inch here or there. So instead of walking away from the lease, he started asking a different question. Not whether the ground could be dried out for good, whether the water table could be lowered, just enough to give roots room to breathe, without losing the deep moisture reserve that made this soil different in the first place. That was a narrower question than most people would think to ask. He picked a limited block, about 12 acres, and planted onions. It seemed reasonable. Onions needed steady moisture. This ground clearly had it. What Elias hadn't worked out yet was how thin the line was between soil that held moisture in reserve and soil that never let the roots come up for air. The water table on that block stayed high through most of the season, higher than the young bulbs could tolerate. Roots sat in saturated soil far longer than they should have. By midsummer, some of the bulbs were soft and misshapen. Disease crept into the wettest rows. At harvest, his equipment bogged down in 3 different sections, and pulling it free cost him time he didn't have during a tight window. By his own count that fall, tallying the lost bulbs, the disease losses, and the hours spent freeing stuck machinery, Elias figured he was close to $3,800 behind where a normal onion season should have left him. It was a hard number to sit with. He'd been right that the ground could hold moisture. He'd been wrong to think that was the same thing as ground that could grow a healthy crop. Wet roots weren't fed roots, they were drowning roots. That distinction cost him almost a full season's profit to learn. So that winter, Elias went back to the ditches with a surveyor's level, the same kind of tool he'd used for years reading grade along the county roads. He walked every outlet on the property. He measured ditch depth in a dozen places. He checked outlet grade, looking for the small drops in elevation that decided whether water actually left the field or just sat there, waiting. After rain, he walked the ground again, marking where puddles lingered and where the soil firmed up within a day. He noted where machinery had sunk the year before and cross-checked those spots against his elevation notes. A pattern started to show itself. It wasn't the whole 41 acres that behaved the same way. Certain low corners held water because the nearest outlet sat too high to drain them properly. Other sections, slightly higher, drained well enough once a shallow ditch was cleaned out and its grade corrected. Elias wasn't trying to turn the muck into something it wasn't. He wasn't chasing dry mineral soil. He was after ground where the water table sat just low enough to keep roots out of standing water. While the soil beneath still held moisture, the crop could draw on later. That winter, with some rented equipment and a hired hand for 2 weeks, he spent about $2,200 cleaning and slightly regrading a handful of ditches, focused only on the sections that showed the best drainage potential. He also made a harder decision. Roughly 10 acres, the lowest and wettest ground on the property, he set aside from onions entirely. No amount of ditch work was going to lower a water table that sat that close to the surface. The following spring, Elias planted a smaller, more careful block, about 9 acres, on the sections where his drainage work had actually changed the water table position. He watched it differently this time. He checked soil moisture by hand after every rain instead of guessing from the surface. He adjusted where he could, and where he couldn't, he simply didn't plant. The bulbs that season came in firmer, fewer soft spots, less disease. It wasn't a spectacular crop. It was simply a crop he could harvest cleanly, without losing equipment in the mud. Elias kept working that way for a couple more seasons, refining which sections earned a place in the onion rotation and which ones stayed better suited to pasture or simply rest. By his third summer on that ground, Elias thought he understood the blocks well enough to trust them. Then the rain stopped. Older growers in the area called it the hottest, driest summer they could remember in decades. Several nearby farmers on lighter mineral soils told Elias they were irrigating every 4 or 5 days that summer just to keep their onion crops from stressing out in the heat. On his best-managed muck blocks, Elias's own notebook told a different story. Water intervals closer to 10 days, sometimes a little longer. Not because the ground had stopped needing water, it was still holding water. It just wasn't drowning the crop with it anymore. His yield that year came in solid, not record-breaking, somewhere close to what a good, ordinary season should produce. But the difference showed up in fewer emergency irrigation runs, less stress on the crop during the worst heat of July, and machinery that never sank once, because by then he knew exactly which ground to trust and which to leave alone. Late that summer, the banker who had once called the lease a swamp came out to see the ground for himself. He didn't ask about the crop. He didn't ask about yield. He stood at the edge of one of the managed blocks and asked a quieter question. "What's your outlet grade out here?" Elias walked him along the ditch line and showed him the same small drops in elevation he'd spent a winter measuring by hand. Nothing about the ground had changed since the year everyone called it a swamp. What had changed was how carefully someone had finally bothered to read it. Everybody thought the black ground held too much water. Elias learned the difference between holding water and drowning in it.